Hi, Lakewood 7th graders. This is Miss V with video 4. And video 4 is all about the percent proportion, which turns out to be a very useful thing. It's got kind of a big name, but it's a handy tool. So we're going to work some problems with the percent proportion, and I'm going to show you how it works. And then I think the name won't sound quite as much of a mouthful. So in the first example, I'm going to say that we have sampled 50 students, and we have found that out of those 50 students, 17 of them play a musical instrument. And I'm interested in knowing the percent of students that play a musical instrument. So what I need to know for percentages is how many out of 100. Because remember, percent is really measuring 100 as the total. And so I ask myself, well, what is this number here that goes on top of 100? Because percent is a comparison to 100%. And so I noticed that to scale up that denominator, I had to multiply times 2. And so I need to do the very same thing to my numerator, and I need to multiply 17 times 2, which tells me that this numerator needs to be 34. So I can conclude that 34% of my students play a musical instrument. Let's take a look at it again through a different example. And let's say that I sample 150 students, and I just go to a school, and as they walk by, I notice whether or not they have red hair. And out of 150 students, I notice that 3 of them have red hair. And I'm interested in knowing the percentage, which is going to be out of 100, the percentage of these students that have red hair. But notice I'm not scaling up anymore, I'm scaling down. And I don't know what to multiply 150 by to get down to 100. So I'm going to let algebra help me out here, and I'm going to say, well, I have 150 students, and I multiplied it by some number, and when I did, I got 100 in order to scale this down. So 150 times some number I don't know is 100. And notice that we're multiplying here, so my inverse operation would be to divide. So 100 divided by 150. I don't know what that is. Let's just go ahead and reduce this fraction. I notice that I can divide 100 by 5, and that gives me 20. And I can divide 150 by 5, and that gives me 30. And now I say, oh, wow, look. I can just divide top and bottom by 10, and I get 2/3. So that tells me what I did right there to scale 150 down to 100 was I multiplied 150 times 2/3. So I need to do that in my numerator. So I'm going to go off in the margin on my paper, and I'm going to say, okay, 3 over 1 times 2 over 3 is 6 over 3, which simplifies to 2. 6 divided by 3 is 2. So I can now say that 2% of my students have red hair. So that's how we use the percent proportion if we want to find percent. But sometimes we know the percent and we want to find the quantity of some number. So in this example, I'm going to talk about soccer. I know soccer is a lot of fun. And I happen to have made a poll and found that in North Carolina, 40% of middle school students enjoy playing soccer. And I'm interested in knowing what that translates to at Lakewood, For example, if 40% of all the students in North Carolina love soccer, and I apply that same statistic to Lakewood, how many students at Lakewood would enjoy soccer? So here's my percent proportion, right? This is the ratio, or what 40% is compared to 100. And I want to know at Lakewood, which has about 300 students, what that number would be. So what I notice is to get from 100 to 300, I had to multiply times 3. And so what I'm going to have to do is scale up my numerator by 3 as well, and I end up getting 40 times 3 is 120. So that tells me 120 students at Lakewood should like playing soccer if Lakewood fits this mold that we have struck in North Carolina. So let's do one more example where we have a percentage and we're trying to go backward to the actual quantity that we have. And I'm going to stick with the fact that 40% of students like soccer. And I'm going to say I went to school and I have no idea how many students go to that school, but I know that 160 of them like soccer. So I'm going to try and figure out how many students are in the school. Well, here's our percent proportion. And what we know is 160 students like soccer, but we don't know that number. So again, I look at what did I have to do to convert that number into that number, and the answer is multiply by 4. And so I'm going to multiply my denominator by 4 as well, and I see that there should be 400 students in that other school. So this is the percent proportion introductory video. I'm going to record one more, and in that video I'm going to do several examples where I use the percent proportion to answer questions about how many questions on a test a student got. A very practical example of this is when we monitor fish in a lake, or maybe the populations of wild animals by tagging them and releasing them. So in percent proportion part 2, which will be video 5, you should expect to find that information. Or actually, let's call it video 4B. See you then.